You're stood right outside your own front gate, having just walked out of a shop, when an officer steps into your path and says 4 words: "Name and address, please." What happens in the next 10 seconds decides everything. Either you deal with it calmly, entirely within your rights, and carry on with your day, or you make one of the 2 mistakes that almost everyone makes in that exact spot, turning a completely routine encounter into a genuine problem. Here's the part nobody warns you about. The vast majority of people give away far more than the law actually demands. Their name, their address, where they've been, where they're headed, the full story, simply because they assume they're required to. Then there's a smaller group who swing the other way. They've picked up a half-remembered rumour that you never have to tell police anything, so they cross their arms, refuse outright, in a situation where they were legally obliged to answer, and end up arrested for it. Both groups have misunderstood the law, and the single most valuable thing I can hand you today is the exact boundary between those 2 positions. When you're genuinely required to give your name in England and Wales, when you're under no obligation whatsoever, and the calm phrasing that keeps you firmly on the right side of that line every time. Keep watching, because by the end of this, you won't be caught off guard by a name and address demand ever again. I am a criminal defence solicitor practicing here in England and Wales, and across 15 years I've stood beside ordinary people through some of the roughest moments of their lives, in police stations, interview rooms, and in the dock. And I can tell you honestly, the number of decent, law-abiding people I've watched trip themselves up over one simple question, "What's your name?" would genuinely astonish you. Not criminals, just people who were never told exactly where the boundary sits. So let me be the one to tell you. And let me make it concrete, because this plays out almost exactly as I'm about to describe. Picture someone walking home one evening. Call him Tom. He hasn't done a single thing wrong. He's simply walking. A patrol car pulls alongside. An officer steps out and asks, "Evening, what's your name and where do you live?" Now watch the 2 ways this can go badly for Tom. In the first version, Tom's anxious and desperate to seem cooperative, so he tells them everything. His name, his address, and then, because the officer keeps chatting, where he's just come from, who he was with, why he's out at all. He's answered every single question and handed over a complete profile of himself, none of which he was ever required to disclose. In the second version, Tom's heard somewhere that police can't make you talk, so he gets defensive and snaps, "I don't have to tell you anything, leave me alone," and storms off. And depending on the circumstances, that Tom may have just committed a criminal offence and could be arrested on the spot. Same 4 words from the officer, 2 completely opposite ways of getting it wrong. This is for making sure you're neither version of Tom, so you know calmly and precisely exactly which situation you're actually standing in. Let's begin with the rule that catches almost everyone off guard, because it's the foundation everything else sits on. In England and Wales, there is no blanket power that forces you to hand over your name. I'll say that again slowly, because people genuinely struggle to accept it. There's no law allowing an officer to approach you on the street with no specific reason, demand your name and address, and require you to give it. We simply don't have what some other countries call a stop and identify law. If an officer asks you outright, with no particular legal power behind the request, you're perfectly entitled, in law, to decline politely and walk on. Refusing to give your name, on its own, when no specific power applies, is not a criminal offence. That's your starting point. That's the ground beneath your feet, and most people have no clue they're already standing on solid footing. While we're on this subject, let's clear up a myth that trips people up just as often, because it sits directly beneath this same principle. There's no national identity card system in this country, and there's no law requiring you to carry identification as you go about your daily life. So if an officer says, "Show me some ID," during an ordinary street stop, understand that outside the specific scenarios we're about to cover, You're not breaking any law simply by not having ID on you, and you're not required to produce documents you're not legally obliged to carry in the first place. People hear the word ID and instantly feel like they've been caught out. You haven't. Not carrying a card isn't a crime, and being unable to produce one, by itself, isn't grounds for anything at all. Tuck that one away too, because officers are well aware most people don't realise it. But, and this is the crucial bit, because getting this wrong is exactly what lands people in trouble, that general freedom has specific carve-outs built into it by Parliament. There are particular circumstances where a specific piece of legislation kicks in, and in those situations you genuinely must provide your details, with refusal becoming an offence. Understanding this side of the boundary matters just as much as understanding the other, because it's this half that keeps you out of a police cell. So let's run through the ones that come up most in everyday life. The big one, the one that trips up the most people, is driving. The instant you're behind the wheel of a vehicle, the rules shift entirely. Under the Road Traffic Act, an officer is entitled to demand your driving licence and your name and address, along with the name and address of the vehicle's registered owner. That's sections 164 and 165 of that Act, and refusing to provide those details when lawfully required is itself an offence. So if you're driving and get pulled over and asked who you are, this is not the moment to bring up no general power. Behind the wheel, that power is real, specific, and non-negotiable, so you comply. Driving is a licensed activity, and identifying yourself as the driver is part of that arrangement. Keep that one firmly separate in your mind from everything else, because it's the exception people confuse most often. The second exception concerns antisocial behaviour. Section 50 of the Police Reform Act 2002 grants a power that works like this. If a uniformed police officer has reasonable grounds to believe you've been behaving or are behaving in a way that's caused or is likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress to another person, that officer can require you to give your name and address. Refuse or give a false name or a fabricated address, and that's a criminal offence, one carrying a fine of up to £1,000 and grounds for immediate arrest. Notice the limits though, because they matter enormously. This power only belongs to an officer in uniform. It requires a genuine, reasonable belief that you've actually behaved antisocially, not mere curiosity on the officer's part. And it entitles them only to your name and address, nothing about your date of birth, your destination, or your life story. So yes, this is a genuine must-comply situation, but a narrow one, hedged with conditions. This is where you need to stay sharp, because Section 50 is the power officers reach for most often when they want your details and have no other legal route to them. It gets stretched constantly. Standing on a street corner, filming in a public place, asking an officer a question they'd rather not answer, or simply being somewhere they'd prefer you weren't. None of that amounts to antisocial behaviour, and none of it alone hands them Section 50 authority. The power requires an actual reasonable belief that you've caused or are likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress to someone specific. So if an officer leans on you for your details and gestures vaguely at antisocial behaviour, you're entitled to test that calmly. Ask, "Can I ask what antisocial behaviour you believe I've been involved in?" Force them to articulate it. If there's a genuine answer, you'll hear it, and then you comply. If the honest answer is that there isn't one, that they simply wanted your information and reached for the nearest available power, you've quietly demonstrated, without ever raising your voice, that you understand this power has boundaries and that you expect it to stay within them. You're not refusing to cooperate, you're simply asking them to justify the power before you treat it as though it applies. There's a third everyday scenario worth knowing too. If you're being reported for an offence, say a driving matter or a fixed penalty notice, you can be required to give your details so the process can actually go ahead. And for anyone watching from north of the border, I'll add this for completeness. Scotland operates under different rules entirely, with police there holding a broader power to demand details in a wider range of situations. But this is about the law in England and Wales specifically. And that's everything I'm covering today. So already the shape of it is coming into view. The default position is that there's no general power. You don't have to give your name. The exceptions are specific and identifiable. You're driving, or an officer reasonably believes you've behaved antisocially, or you're being reported for an offence. And the entire trick, the thing that keeps you calm and protected, is being able to recognise in the moment exactly which of these situations you're in. Which brings us to stop and search, because this is where the two concepts get tangled together constantly. A stop and search is an entirely separate power, and understanding how it interacts with everything above matters, because it confuses people all the time. If an officer has reasonable grounds to search you, for drugs, a weapon, or stolen property, that search power stands on its own 2 feet. And here's the critical point. You cannot refuse a lawful search. If the grounds genuinely exist, the search is going ahead, and physically resisting it can be an offence in itself. But, and almost nobody realises this, you are not required to give your name and address purely for the search to take place. The search can proceed whether or not you identify yourself. These are 2 entirely separate questions, so keep them apart in your mind. In any stop and search, the officer is obligated to tell you certain things before they touch you. There's a set of them, remembered by officers using the acronym GOWISELY, their name and the station they're attached to, the object of the search, what they're looking for, the legal power being used, the grounds for suspicion, and your right to a written record of the whole encounter. Think about how much that works in your favour. It means you get to hear, out loud, the exact power they're claiming to use. And a power that has to be named is a power you can check, both on the day and afterwards. Which leads to the single most useful sentence in this entire piece, the question that cuts straight through all of it. Whenever an officer's questioning you, and you're genuinely uncertain whether you're required to answer, ask, calmly and politely, am I being detained, or am I free to go? That question alone does an enormous amount of heavy lifting. If you're not being detained under some specific power, then you're free. And if you're free to go, you can simply and courteously leave. If you are being detained, they're obligated to name the power they're using to hold you there, and now you know exactly where you stand. Follow it up with, what power are you using? Said evenly, with no attitude attached, those 2 questions move you instantly from guessing to knowing. They separate a genuine legal requirement from an officer simply chancing their arm. And officers do chance it fairly regularly, precisely because they're counting on you not knowing the difference. Now, there's one mistake I really want you to avoid, because it quietly causes more damage than anything else, and it has nothing to do with your name. It's volunteering information. Giving your name when a genuine power requires it is one thing. Answering questions is an entirely separate matter, and you're almost never obliged to do that. Where have you been tonight? Where are you heading? What were you doing there? Have you got anything on you? None of that requires an answer from you. Handing over your name under Section 50, assuming that power genuinely applies, doesn't mean you've agreed to narrate your entire evening. This is exactly where the nervous, eager-to-please version of Tom gives away far more than necessary. Not because the law demanded it, but because silence felt uncomfortable and the officer kept the questions flowing. You're allowed to stay completely polite while simply not engaging. I'd rather not get into that. Works perfectly well. You can be cooperative about what you're legally required to do, and quietly silent about everything you're not. That combination is the whole game. So let's put all of it together into what you actually say and do, because this is the part that protects you. Imagine an officer stops you and asks for your name. Your first calm move is the pivot question. Can I ask, am I being detained or am I free to go? If the honest answer is that you're free to go, thank them and leave. You're never obliged to hand over anything. If they say you're being detained or that they're exercising some power, Your next quiet question is, which power are you using, please? Make them state it out loud. If they name a genuine one that applies to your situation, whether you're the driver or they reasonably believe you've behaved antisocially, then you give exactly what that power requires: your name and address, calmly and nothing beyond it. You don't argue about whether the power genuinely applies while standing on the pavement. That's a battle for later, not for the street. And if they can't name a power, and you're not driving, and there's no search taking place, and there's no suggestion of antisocial behaviour, then you're very likely standing in that default space where you simply weren't required to answer, and you can politely go on your way. Throughout all of it, hold 3 things in mind. Stay calm and courteous, because aggression is the one thing that can turn "he wasn't doing anything" into "he was causing alarm and distress," and that's the last thing you want to hand them. Give only what the specific power actually demands: your name and address if it genuinely applies, not a running commentary on your evening. And never, under any circumstances, give a false name or a made-up address when a power genuinely applies, because unlike silence, that's a clear-cut offence, and an entirely needless one. Comply with what's real, stay quiet on what isn't, and keep your temper the entire way through. And here's the principle underpinning all of it, the one worth carrying forward, because it's the difference between people who walk away clean and people who don't. You comply on the day, and you challenge it afterwards. If an officer insists a power applies, and you believe they've got it wrong, the street is not the place to prove that. Give them what the power genuinely requires, stay calm, make sure you obtain that written record if a search took place, and note down names, badge numbers, the time, and the location. If it turns out they were wrong, that's when you pursue it, through a formal complaint, and if it's serious enough, through the independent police watchdog and a solicitor. Your dignity on the day is calm cooperation. Your leverage afterwards is the record you kept, never the reverse. So let's bring this together. When an officer says name and address, understand exactly what's being asked of you and work out which situation you're actually in. Remember the default position in England and Wales. There's no blanket power forcing you to give your name, and refusing on its own isn't an offence. Remember the specific exceptions that switch that off. You're driving, or a uniformed officer reasonably believes you've behaved antisocially, or you're being reported for something. And in those cases, you give your name and address calmly, because refusing or lying is what actually becomes the offence. Remember the pivot question that tells you which situation applies. Am I being detained, or am I free to go? And what power are you using? Remember that a search stands on its own. You can't refuse a lawful one, but you're not required to identify yourself for it to happen. And remember that answering questions is almost always optional, even in situations where giving your name isn't. Comply with what's genuinely required. Stay quiet on the rest, and keep calm throughout. Because here's the underlying truth of it. In that moment, the officer is very often relying on exactly one thing: that you don't know where the line sits. That you'll either hand over your entire life story out of nerves, or refuse everything out of bravado, and either way, get it wrong. The single most powerful thing you can do is stand there calmly and show them, in one quiet sentence, that you know precisely where that line falls. That changes the entire encounter, every time.